the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual. This is episode 68.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
Just 2 years after the publication of the book, The Starfleet Technical Manual by Franz Joseph, some friends in Manhattan got the idea to do their own reference book. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casco. The result was the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual. We're going to tell you how that book came about, but first, let's tell everyone how to find us.
You're right. We should do that. Just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70strek. And you can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com.
You can also find this show on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search for 70s Trek and please consider leaving us a comment or a review. When you do, that helps others find the show.
You know, it's funny, Kelly. I mean, you and I were both alive and grew up in the 70s, but it was such a unique period. You know, it's a time, we've said this before social media, before the internet, before cell phones or even desktop computers. Yet fans of Star Trek were out there using the tools of the day to create fanzines and books about the show. It boggles my mind.
Me too. I mean, I can't really imagine. It just really hurts. Gives you a headache, right? How did they do it? I mean, they created this printed material before the digital age. You know, people, I guess, didn't know the difference. They didn't realize it was hard because they didn't have it.
That's right.
So, and you know, the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual is a perfect example of this.
It is. And, you know, these pages were created on a typewriter and the diagrams were hand-drawn. But this book was still made and it was still published.
Yeah, the best part, I think, is that there was a bunch of fans that created this book. And they were, you know, just teens, 20s, you know.
They were young.
They were young.
Young people doing it, yeah. And they just loved the show so much that they wanted to create something. Right. You know, Kelly, you looked at the story behind the creation of this book. So why don't you jump in and start? Sure.
So the book was first published as a fan publication by Starfleet Productions, Inc. Now, Starfleet Productions, Inc. really was this group of people that worked and, you know, hung out at the Federation Trading Post. You know, that Star Trek store located in New York in the mid-'70s. We talked to Doug Drexler about that. And it was run by Doug Drexler and Ron Barlow. You know, they ran it jointly.
Don't you wish you lived in Manhattan and could go to that store in the 70s?
Oh, my gosh. I'd be there every day.
Every day.
Every day. So it was, like I said, published as a fan publication, but Ballantine Books picked it up and made it an official, you know, publication in that same year, in 1977. And they did two printings in that year, first in October and then the second later in November. It was researched and compiled by Eileen Palestine. And now Eileen, she was Ron Barlow's girlfriend at the time, and she was a nurse. And we'll get more into that, but this is really her brainchild. The illustrators were Doug Drexler and Anthony Fredrickson, who also worked at the Federation Trading Post. And he has a significant Star Trek resume. The editors, Eileen Palestine, who we talked about, and the associate editor was Jeffrey Mandel. He has a significant Star Trek resume, which includes some working with some books with Doug and like the USS Enterprise Officer's Manual and Star Trek maps.
Oh,
Also
cool.
Star Trek star charts.
So these guys really, they not only did the medical reference manual, but they went on to do a lot more afterwards.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes.
They were
absolutely.
really involved.
Yeah, I mean, Jeffrey was also production assistant in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and he was involved in production in Next Gen. He also did several of the movies he was involved with as a production artist and designer.
Cool.
And in Voyager. Oh my gosh,
talk about
just goes on.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time. Wow.
Exactly. We spoke, though, to Doug Drexler in episode 36 of 70s Trek, and he told us this about the medical reference manual.
It was published by Ballantine, I think, and I was never thrilled with the idea of it. It was Ron, who ran the Federation Trading Post with me, had a girlfriend named Eileen, and she was a nurse. And the tech manual was a big hit. And she says, I want to do a medical reference. And I'm thinking, what the hell are you going to do? You know, I just never really saw what was so exciting about that idea. But I guess she and Ron wrote everything. And me and Anthony Fredrickson, you know, did a lot of primitive drawings. There were no computers or anything, you know, it was all hand drawn, and we were just learning how to draw, you know, at the time, but it was a good experience, you know.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah. So, I mean, Doug gives the origin of it better than we could. So might as well let him tell us, right?
That's right.
So I've got a question here. So this medical reference, was it canon, do you think?
Are you asking me rhetorically, or do you want me to answer?
Oh, rhetorically.
I'll keep my mouth shut then. Go ahead.
Well, officially, no, it wasn't. However, several of the images from the Intelligent Aliens chapter and the Parasite chapters made it into DS9's episode, The Nagus. And this is from season 1. Now, if you look in this episode at the LCARS display in the schoolroom, you can see some examples of drawings in this from the book.
I kind of remember that now that you're saying it.
Yeah. So like the Horta.
The Excalbion, wasn't the Excalbion in there?
Yeah. Yep. There was also the Nebian Slime Devils. Love them.
Love them.
And the Tribbles and the Regulan Bloodworms.
Oh, yeah. Those are nasty.
Yes. Now, these images, I guess, came from Jeffrey Mandel, who was a production assistant for DS9 at the time. He pulled these images from the medical reference and used them in the show. So,
Isn't that cool?
So I guess at least those images are canon, right?
So you can say that sections of this book are canon.
True.
And actually, you know, the book pulls from Star Trek, and it's pulling from the on-air episodes. So 75% of what it's pulling is accurate because it also projects out a little bit with, you know, cell structures and things that we have no idea about.
Right.
So is it canon? Yeah, no.
Yes and no.
Yeah. It's a good way to look at it. Yeah. No.
Yeah. No. So, all right. So let's move on. So, Bob, you looked at the book and the different chapters. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, let's do that. Well, first, let me start with the book itself. It is very similar to the Starfleet Technical Manual, about the same size of a book. There's a nice blue cover with white lettering on the outside, and as you open it up, you're going to see a list of credits. That's where we see Eileen Palestine's name as the editor. And then the third credit down is Doug Drexler, and we've talked about him already, listed as a research illustrator. And the last credit is given to the medical advisor, Dr. Leonard McCoy, MD. I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah, definitely.
On the next page is the dedication, and I thought I would go ahead and read this. This book is dedicated to the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry, who so brilliantly inspired us to grow our own wings. Thank you, Mr. Roddenberry, for teaching us how to fly. We also dedicate this book to the rest of the great bird's flock who aided in his and our flight of fancy. We thank you all. And then it goes on to list contributors to the show, such as Gene Kuhn, Mark Daniels, Fred Freiberger, Dorothy Fontana, Matt Jeffries. And at the end of this list, there were more names. At the end of the list of names, it also says, particularly DeForest Kelley, which I thought, again, was very nice. It's a nod to McCoy and Kelly's role as Dr. McCoy. The book is also dedicated to, quote, Ron, unquote. And we can only assume that that is Ron Barlow, as you mentioned, the boyfriend of Eileen. And the sentence goes on to read, without whose unflagging support, it never would have been done. So that's kind of nice, too. She's saying, hey, boyfriend, thanks for all the support.
Okay. Let's move on.
Let's move on. On the following page, they provide us with the Hippocratic Oath that all doctors take before they can practice, which I thought was very nice. That's a great idea. That's kind of a very large 20,000-foot view of medicine, and let's start there and start to zero in, and that's exactly what this book does. Then the introduction provides some historical context for the practice of medicine on sea ships, and I thought that's a really neat look of how medicine evolved and some manuals, if you will, from the 1600s about how to practice medicine and take care of your implements and things like that exist.
Right. I thought it made a lot of sense. You'd figure it'd carry on into a starship.
Yes. Oh, I thought it was wonderful. And it's written by historian John Gill. Of course, we know that name from the episode Patterns of Force. Mm-hmm. Gill is the historian who thought he could introduce the efficiency of the Nazis without introducing their violence. Of course, he was kind of wrong.
Yeah.
So just as we saw in the technical manual by Joseph, the authors of this book are also treating it as if it's an actual 23rd century manual. And that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So there's also a timeline in the book that is showing medical advancements through the centuries, and also some background data that's important in medicine, such as the periodic table of elements. There's an explanation of radiation, of cell mutation, of drugs, and these are drugs whose names we heard on Star Trek, and then also diseases, also names that we heard from the show. Then we get into the life sciences section, and here the authors begin to lay out the different physiologies and anatomies of the various humanoid species in the Federation. Earlier, we were talking about, is it canon, is it not? The book kind of projects things out. Here, we're beginning to project. There's nothing from the series that lays out any of this other than the fact that Vulcans have their hearts in different locations. I think that's like the only anatomy clue we ever get about different species. So
I think there was something about blood and then
green blood,
carbon-based versus...
Yes, right. You're right. So what this section begins to do is talk about all of the proposed, by the authors, anatomical differences. And they look at cranial structures and the design of hearts and even cell structures. It goes down to that scale. And we can also assume that these diagrams were hand-drawn by Doug Drexler and Anthony Fredrickson. And it's kind of cool because they're very well done. They're definitely drawings, but they're very well done. They're not sketches.
Yeah, even though we called them primitive, but I thought they were done in the style of a medical manual. Yes. Yeah, very much so.
The reference manual also explains the differences in the psychologies of Federation humanoids. I thought that was really interesting. And there's also a chapter on intelligent non-humanoid species, and these include the Excalbians, the Horda, the Medusans, and the Tholians. And again, all with diagrams of each species. There are also sections on parasites and on plants. Then there's a section that describes psionics and really the different kind of psionics, such as telepathy or moving things with your mind. All of that's in this section. And that then is followed by a section on Federation first aid. Now, this was kind of interesting to me. First of all, first aid hasn't changed that much between when I was a kid in Boy Scouts and the 23rd century. First aid is first aid. That's what you do. But I do have to mention this. The book discusses artificial ventilation. That's when a breathing tube is introduced and put down a person's throat so they can breathe. The diagram is of a Gorn laying on its back with a ventilation tube in its mouth. And I just thought, wow, a Gorn?
Well, you figure it's going to be different from species to species.
Oh, yeah, I'll bet.
But a Gorn.
Yeah, right. Also in this section are instructions on how to lift or move a victim after they've been hurt. And again, anyone in Boy Scouts might remember some of these techniques, and they include things like the 3-man lift or the 4-handed seat. I remember practicing the 4-handed seat.
Yeah.
And the 2-handed seat and so on. And again, these are illustrated with hand drawings of Starfleet figures all in uniform. But it's very nicely done.
Yeah, they look better than my first aid books that I had growing up.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The last section is on equipment, and it includes diagrams and explanations of all the medical devices that we saw in Star Trek. And this section reminds me probably the most of the style of the technical manual by Franz Joseph. So that sort of wraps up the book, because when we're done with the last medical device, there's the cover. And you close it up and you're done with it. So, Kelly, let me ask you, any closing thoughts about the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual?
Well, I will say that I'm kind of with Doug on this, where I didn't see a need for a medical reference. And as a kid and a fan, I totally overlooked it until we started doing podcasts. But once I opened it up and looked at it, I thought the analysis they did, the thoughtfulness of like putting the psionics in there. Of course, why wouldn't you? We've run into all kinds of situations where that was a thing. So, I retract my statement. I think it's an important part of the Star Trek library.
I kind of agree with you. The Medical Reference Manual, I think it does a great job of touching on just about every medical fact or topic that was presented in Star Trek. I mean, this thing is painstakingly researched.
Oh, yeah.
She did an excellent job, and obviously, as a nurse, had some interest in it herself. So it's very well done. And it's another one of those pieces, those touchstones from the 1970s that when you had it in your hand at that time and you opened it up, you just knew Star Trek lives. On our next episode, we take a look at Mr. Spock himself.
Of course, it's Leonard Nimoy. See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.